pretty good. Just there we go. It's recording. I'd hate to get all the way through this and then not record. But no, I'm doing pretty good. I can't complain. Last week and then finally graduate.
Yeah,
Before the
congratulations.
Lord, we'll see in a week. But no, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Mhm.
So this is the story behind the story, and I really enjoyed your piece about the child services thing you did a while back.
Mhm.
So I'd really just like to delve into that and figure out how you went about things and really just talk about the story and what it meant to you.
Sure.
Alrighty, but before we get started, do you mind saying your name and then giving your title, just so I have
Yeah,
something to refer to?
definitely. Yeah. So, Kayla Branch, Kayla Branch, and I'm an investigative reporter with The Frontier.
How did you, once you graduated from Gaylord, how did you end up at the Frontier?
Yeah. So, I started working for the Oklahoman right around graduation in 2019, and I spent about 2 years there almost. And I was doing county government reporting, kind of some general assignment reporting, but also wherever I could, trying to sneak in longer stories, data stories. And so when an opportunity opened up at the Frontier to have a full-time state government reporter while they were expanding their staff, I was recommended for that position, and it was a good fit for the type of work that I wanted to do. And so that's kind of how I ended up at the Frontier.
Very nice. Just reading some of your work, it really seems like you fit in, and you can really see the joy that you have in your stories,
Thank you.
especially no problem at all. Especially in that, I hate keep I keep referring it as the Child Protective Services story.
Mhm.
Do you have a specific name that you refer to it as?
And we're talking about the one with was it the budget cut story related to some of the DHS offices across the state? That
Yes,
one?
and yeah, it was.
Yeah, I refer to that story as like the office closures story. That was kind of what tipped me off to it as something that we needed to write about. Was when when one of the largest state agencies says that they are going to close basically half of their brick and mortar locations across the state, that kind of raised some red flags for me. So that's how I refer to it, the office closure story.
So you found out about the largest state agency closing its doors and limiting office spaces. At least that was my understanding from reading it. What
Mm-hmm.
was your initial reaction to the red flags and wanting to go at that?
Yeah. And so initially I heard about this from a friend. So it was a friend who had a friend who worked for DHS. And they closed down their office. This is all during COVID. So you're kind of used to hearing about office closures, but I was told, it's this person that works for DHS is having to house like records and things from her garage because she can't access the office anymore. And so I think my initial reaction was just shock, like that the bad working conditions for a really important job in the state. I'm trying to take care of kids, trying to make sure that families have the resources that they need. So it was a little bit of shock initially, and then frustration because I couldn't really find any information about how DHS had decided to make this choice, and kind of what was going on as they transitioned from having offices in a bunch of counties to people just working remotely in a job that is difficult, I think, to do remote in a lot of ways. So yeah, initially it was that shock and then frustration as there was just a big lack of information about it.
See, that's the interesting part. I grew up in foster care, so I was sort of familiar with the way things work. And I
Mm-hmm.
was imagining myself as I read the story, if I was a child in their situation during COVID, who is going to come out and check on me and who is going to just be held responsible
Yeah,
ultimately?
exactly.
But a part of it was I was still amazed of how much information you were able to obtain. And I was curious because it was during COVID.
Mhm.
How in the world did you go about digging that deep and while meanwhile staying safe?
Yeah, yeah. There were a lot of pieces to that story for sure. Some of the easy ones that I was able to find online, Census Bureau data has a lot of details on kind of poverty rates. And so that was helpful for me mapping out the impact on just one kind of data point. But also I requested a ton of records from DHS, so the Department of Human Services. I worked with them for months trying to get records on foster care statistics, calls to DHS, the number of people that tried to access services during the pandemic. So there's a lot of back and forth with that state agency. And then just a ton of phone calls. Once I kind of narrowed down, where the offices had closed and where the impact might be the biggest. So which communities had the biggest needs and now no longer had a brick and mortar location to access state services. I just made a bunch of phone calls in places where I thought that people might be interacting with a Department of Human Services worker. So schools, public libraries, those types of things. And once we had actually gotten people to talk to us to confirm that this was a problem they were having and they were really scared and worried about what was going to happen in the future, we made some kind of strategic visits to a few places. We focused in I believe it was Adair County, kind of where we did most of our on the ground reporting. So we went out there and we had set up several interviews beforehand, and I kind of had told people where we were going to be going, and they all felt comfortable. We felt comfortable. I believe school was out at this point, so there weren't a bunch of students when we visited the school, and they had their COVID protocols, so took your temperature, we all wore masks, so yeah, there were definitely precautions, but it didn't change too much in terms of just the general reporting avenues that I took.
So I'm curious. I understand that they had their protocol, so it kind of, I believe, will answer my question. But I was still curious. After all the reaching out phone calls and the difficulty of doing that, I imagine, or at least I would be annoyed if I was the one receiving a million phone calls from an investigative journalist trying to figure out what is going on. What was the feedback from the people you were trying to reach out to?
Yeah, well, the sources that were impacted by the office closures, they were great. They were happy to work with us. They were really happy with the way the story turned out. The Department of Human Services, they have a few key people in their communications department that I work with even still to this day. And we've got a pretty good relationship. I think that state agencies feel like they have to be very careful with what they say, what kind of information they give out. My goal is, to hold folks accountable while being as accurate as possible with as much context as I can fit into a story. And I think that so far, the state agencies that I worked with have respected that, even if at times they haven't liked, the story or the direction or the perspective that I was really highlighting. They've respected that I've tried to be really thorough. I've done good fact checking. I stay in communication with them. There aren't a lot of surprises. And I try to make sure that, I'm as respectful as possible while still doing the work that needs to be done, holding people accountable when they need to be held accountable.
I think that's the goal, or at least should be the goal for every journalist. So good job on your end. Um, I am curious, what is it like when you're doing everything you can on your end and you're dealing with a powerful state agency like you were? I don't want to say you got big headed, but there's got to be, to some degree, just some kind of power that you feel that you possess over somebody. Did you feel like that at all?
I think that there's a recognition, especially when you are working on a story, you've got a tip, you're working on a story, and you're finding out like this is a real thing. This has been confirmed by multiple people. My senses, my nose was good, and I'm on the right track to write a story that hopefully will have impact, and will push people to be more transparent or to make changes or whatever it is. And so I think that there is that sense when a journalist is on a good story. And I felt excited. I felt a little nervous. It's a big responsibility when you have a story like that to make sure that you execute it well. And so I usually feel that pressure. The only time I ever really feel myself have that surge of like, okay, I'm going to lay my foot down when it comes to a state agency is when they're being really obstructive to what I'm trying to do. So they're not responding to phone calls. They're not responding helpfully to information or data requests. They won't provide someone for an interview. They won't answer questions, all those things. I think that's the only time where I feel like I can exercise the power of the fact that I'm going to write the story. And if you don't participate in my reporting process, especially on a topic that directly and potentially negatively is going to impact a lot of people, I'm going to write all of that in there, and it's going to make you look really, really bad. And so I would encourage you to participate in what I'm trying to do. And usually that is helpful. Usually they will answer the questions. They will, get back to you at that point. That's really the only time though that I feel like, all right, it's, going to have to lay down the law of what will happen if you're doing something with taxpayer dollars that are negatively impacting communities and you don't want to answer questions about that. That's kind of the only time that I feel I have to do that type of work. But luckily, DHS was helpful with this story. They provided their director for an interview. They gave me data. Didn't have to do that with them, so that was good.
Very nice. It would be something else if they did, because I can imagine the story you would have created.
Yeah, that would have been, if they hadn't responded to my request, it would have been very high in the story, right up at the top, that they wouldn't answer questions.
Rightfully so too. So when you got all the information in and you're reeling it in and you're piecing things together, what did you see as your ultimate goal?
I think it was kind of twofold. One, there were a lot of people that had no idea that this was happening. They didn't know, maybe they don't access DHS services, and they just didn't even realize that no longer would there be a location in their area where people who needed those services could go to get them and know that was a place they could go to get them. So I think it was really trying to inform folks what was happening. And then also for the people who felt like they were being impacted and who were being impacted, it was more difficult for them to get the help that they needed. I wanted them to feel like they had a platform to air their grievances, really. I mean, like we were just talking about, DHS is a powerful state agency. It's not always easy to get somebody on the phone. And so I felt like it was a good way to talk to the people who'd been directly impacted and allow them a place to, talk about the struggles that they were having with this new system, and to be able to directly take those to DHS leadership and hold them accountable. Sometimes I feel like as a journalist, you can be a mediary between people directly in community that are struggling and the people in places of power or authority. Those two groups usually, they don't talk to each other very much. And so I feel like as a journalist, that's a big responsibility to be able to go between those groups. So I felt like that was a big plus of being able to work on this story.
Do you feel like you successfully were able to just kind of pull them together to bridge the gap, so to speak?
I think so. I think that, some of the feedback I got from the people in the story that I talked to, my sources, they felt better just being able to know that, like, one, we're not alone. You've talked to other people that are struggling, so it's not just us. And also, like, they were able to vent or talk about their problems in a productive way. That alone made people feel better about the situation, and like they were actually being listened to. And I think DHS, when I talked to them, they felt also like I heard what their goal was, but that I was able to provide them some examples where what they were trying to do didn't work out well. There are real, literal people that are struggling with the decisions that you've made. And I know they were very interested in those particular areas, those communities. They wanted more information about, who did you talk to? What problems did they have? And I'm hoping that they, took that information and worked to find a solution.
Can you give me an example of something that they were happy about you bringing to their attention?
Yeah, I think just the school employee that we spoke with, we interviewed. She really had a hard time getting a hold of anybody from DHS. She used to be able to call the office. Now there isn't an office in their area, which was very rural. So a lot of people, they didn't have cell service when they're working from their homes, and she couldn't get a hold of anybody. It was a real struggle, and they had a lot of kids that needed services, that needed to have that type of connection, and so DHS was interested when I was talking about that impact, and that wasn't something I think that they had maybe considered or thought about all the way, at least on the ground. When you're making decisions in Oklahoma City, it's a little bit different than if you're out in a rural area. You might not, just because of geography, know, okay, this is what will or won't work across the state as a whole. And so I think they were interested to hear some of that when we were talking.
It's a perfect segue because when I read the story, that was the thing that stood out the most, was just like the official locations that they had were not there, and they were working out of garages and whatnot. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I could have swore you wrote about people working out of garages, and I was dumbfounded. I just couldn't believe that the operations were being handled that way.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I included it in the official story, but that was the tip I got, that there was a DHS worker who was having to work out of her garage at home, and a lot of people were working from their homes, wherever that might have been. Or I know, I heard that some people were going to do like visitations at McDonald's, or in some room at a service agency that they were partnering with, but the door was locked. There were a lot of different kind of anecdotal stories that I heard about struggles that people were having. But one of the challenges that we really never overcame with reporting on the story is that a lot of DHS workers don't want to be interviewed. They don't want to talk. They don't want to be, interviewed on the record and have their name associated with a complaint against their employer, which I think a lot of people feel that way. You might not want to be quoted in a newspaper saying that your employer is doing something wrong when you haven't been like authorized to talk about it. So it makes sense. But it was something that we came up against, that, we didn't have a DHS worker who was okay with us quoting them in the story, and because they were worried about what that might do to their job or retaliation or whatever it might have been. So it was hard to confirm some of those scenarios because the DHS workers just weren't comfortable, talking to us for the story.
That would be a difficult thing. I can't really go through with the story if you can't confirm a couple of key information. So, how did you get over that hurdle? I know you said you didn't completely get around it, but
Yeah.
any alternatives?
Yeah. So there were some things that, we just couldn't include, which I wish that we could include everything, but there weren't, just because of the standard that I feel like I want to have for my reporting and fact checking and confirmation before I put things in a story like this. I felt like we didn't have enough. So there were some things that we didn't include. But I think, especially when you're doing investigative reporting, and especially when you're working on a topic that might make somebody look bad, or people don't want to have kind of aired out in the public, you have to be ready to pivot. If you can't get this specific piece of data, what other data can you get that's close enough that it'll highlight the same point? And so there were things like that when I was requesting records from DHS. Some things they were like, well, we don't even keep it that way. And so you just have to be kind of on your toes and ready to adjust. Or, if you're asking a source a question and you really want to ask that, this question just the way you have it written, and you expect them to give you an answer, you already kind of know what you're looking for, but they tell you something else. You just have to be ready to be on your toes, and to really follow, the facts and pivot where necessary. So I felt like we were still able to get most of what we wanted in the story, and most of what was important to add into the story, even if we weren't able to confirm some of those more anecdotal details.
Were there times where you began to feel discouraged because you were really trying to dig and figure out what had happened?
For sure. I think I worked on this story. Well, I got my initial tip when I was still at the Oklahoman. And that would have been in like 2020. And I didn't even have the time then to work on this story. So it was just in the back of my mind, and I really wanted to write it, but I didn't have the time. I was doing daily news reporting. I was working weekend shifts, COVID, so that was discouraging for sure. But then when I came to the frontier and started to have time to work on stories like this, it took about 4 months of really solid reporting time dedicated to this story in particular. And so just that time management, you got to keep your motivation up as you keep going along. It's a longer process than I think you're used to. So that can be discouraging. And then, sometimes you get told no. I mean, for every 20 phone calls you make, you probably get like 2 or 3 that are really, really helpful. And then the rest maybe aren't so helpful, or people are just like, don't call me back. Don't ever call my phone again, And so I think that can be discouraging. I think that it can be nerve-wracking when you're working with state agencies and you are working on a story that might make them look bad. How do you handle that interview? How do you go in and be prepared for a director or whoever you might be interviewing to really push back against what you're going to be bringing to them, and to maybe get frustrated or angry that you're writing this or whatever it might be? Like, how do you navigate that? And that can take a lot of emotional energy to figure out. So there were definitely a lot of pieces to this that were new to me when I very first started working at the frontier. But overall, I felt like the more I reported, even when there were roadblocks, the more I knew that this was a story that was real, was happening, and was important. And that was enough to kind of push me or propel me through the times that were maybe a little bit more challenging.
And my next question was how you were able to keep morale up, because that's a grueling process. 4
Yeah.
months long, that's not something I have zero experience with. So I can't even fathom how you just keep it up and want to continue moving forward, because I don't have the attention span for that. I'm going to want to move on to whatever I feel is more pressing at the time.
Right.
So
That's
you kind of,
that,
yeah.
yeah. That's the big question. I feel like when it comes to the type of reporting people want to do, like, do you want to be a daily reporter? Do you maybe want to work at a weekly magazine? I don't know. But yeah, that was a big change for me. Even though I wanted to do longer reporting, figuring out how to actually do it and manage yourself and keep the pace when you're in month 2 and nobody's answering your phone calls and you haven't gotten your records request back, and like, what do you do? That is challenging for sure, and it's taken me a while to feel like I know how to handle it. And I think I've been at the frontier for a little over 2 years now, so there was a learning curve for sure.
Kudos to you, because the story you put out was just excellent.
Thank you.
Was there any other concerns that you were like you just felt like you hit a wall with, and it was going to be impossible to get around?
I think the DHS employees was probably the biggest one, for sure, because we weren't able to get anyone to go on the record with us. That was definitely the biggest one. I'm trying to think. Most of the other types of sources, like the ideal types of sources that we thought would be helpful to illustrate this story, we were eventually able to get. I think I included maybe 4 or 5 different types of sources to illustrate the impact of this choice. We made many more than 4 or 5 phone calls to all different types of people. And so I got told no, a lot. Mostly, some people were like, I don't know what you're talking about. Or other people just were like, this is happening. We're having a problem with it, but we don't want, to be quoted in a story. So initially that can feel kind of like a wall while you're still trying to figure out who are my sources going to be. But, we were lucky that we just kept making phone calls until we felt like we had enough to be able to tell the story appropriately. And luckily it didn't take too long. I think it was a couple weeks that I was like searching around for people to talk to. So that was pretty good timing.
The last question of the story, unless there was something else you really felt that was necessary to be talked about, like an element of the story. I was curious about the feedback overall. Like, were people happy about what you were doing, shedding light on this, and how things were going to move forward?
Yeah, I got a lot of really good feedback, both from, just readers, from other journalists that even didn't know that this was a problem that was going on, from, groups. I got a lot of emails of people saying like, oh, it finally makes sense. I've been calling this phone number and it's not working. So yeah, there was a ton of good feedback. People were very happy to have some answers on, what was going on in their communities. Because again, I mean, Oklahoma has 77 counties and about half no longer have a DHS location. And a lot of people didn't know why, or that it had even happened. And so there was a lot of good feedback from communities that were just glad that someone was highlighting it and happy to have a little bit more information. And there were former DHS employees that were glad that somebody was looking at DHS. It's, one of the largest state agencies, and it is really complicated and complex. They have a lot of money, and people don't write a lot about kind of their internal operations just because it's confusing, it's complex, there's a lot going on. And so they were happy that somebody was paying attention to, a state agency that is supposed to be helping folks and making it easy for them to access services. So it was very good feedback. I was very glad. I was nervous when we hit, the publish button. Like, I don't know, I hope I got everything right. I hope I did the story justice. And I was happy to know that people were glad with the work.
I was curious about that because when you're just talking about DHS, you can hear so many negative opinions. So I was just curious about the final product that was put out, how it was perceived. But no, I'm glad it was, because that's difficult work I don't even want to touch. That was, you really went in and went under the hood to figure it out.
Yeah, there
So
was a lot there, but I'm glad it went well.
me too. But that the complex the complexity of the story just makes me think about how many people were working on this story with you. It couldn't have just been you, was it?
So I was the main reporter. I was the only reporter who was gathering data, doing interviews, writing. We're a very small team at the Frontier right now. There are 2 full-time reporters, and we've got like a managing editor and an executive editor. We all kind of write and edit, but so we're very small. And so yeah, it was just me and then my editor, which she was great. She was very helpful. And we had a lot of drafts that went back and forth between the two of us. But yeah, it was just me doing the legwork.
Good grief, Kayla. That was, I didn't think that was actually going to be your response.
Mm-hmm.
So, images and things of that nature. How did you go about getting those,
Yeah, so when
especially
we
during
went
COVID?
oh yeah, yes. So when we went to do our day of reporting in Adair County, I had another colleague come with me, and he did photos. So I was doing the interviews, and he was hanging out taking pictures. And like I said, we were wearing masks, but when he was going to take pictures of somebody, he had them like take their mask off so that we could have the full image. There were a couple I think there was a map in the story, and I made that map so that we could have everything kind of shown with have some graphics. So that's kind of how we went about that, which I was glad to have a lot of photos to break up. The story's pretty long, so we had several pictures to help break that up.
Yeah, but after 4 months of work, it's going to have some depth to it.
Yeah.
That was kind of, at least I'm not writing as long as that, but I've
Mm-hmm.
tried to mirror that style where you do subheadings and kind of break apart the text. Was that a specific strategy that you thought was going to be really efficient for this particular story?
Mm-hmm. For sure. That's something like that style of writing is something I was introduced to actually when I was at the OU Daily. I'm still in college. We would have some longer stories. And when you're looking at an issue, you're doing more than the typical news story. You're going to have more than 500 words, and you're trying to include a lot of information. It can be really helpful to have a section that's like, all right, we're going to intro, and then we're going to have section A where we talk about A. We're going to have section B where we talk about B, and we'll have section C where we bring everything together. That can be really helpful, not just in keeping somebody's attention span, because that is part of the challenge in a longer story, but also in helping your readers kind of synthesize the information, that can be really helpful to break it out. So I think, yeah, going into this, we expected there's going to have to be some sort of structure to this story that helps really break it out, from, whether it's we're talking to sources that have been impacted, we're talking to DHS and their response, we're having the end part of the story. Yeah, we definitely tried to break it up as best we could.
I just think it was a great job, like just organizing wise.
Thank you.
Is there any other element that we didn't talk about the story that you feel like definitely should be?
Um, I think we really covered most of it. I think the only other thing that um I always try to include in stories that I write, especially longer stories, it's just making sure that you are able to talk to people who have been directly impacted by whatever's happening. Um, I think that makes it more difficult. It takes more time. And so sometimes people, you don't have the time to do that. You're on deadline and you're trying to, meet your editor's expectations. You're trying to go fast. You're trying to be first, whatever it might be. And people will skip that step. But I can't even imagine having written this story and not having gone to the schools and to the library and to the police department, having talked to those people who can really say, this is why this matters. And this is really happening it's happening to me, it's happening to my neighbors, and it's happening to people in my community. That's such an important point to all these types of stories. So I feel like I was just really grateful to be able to add that piece in, and it really makes the difference in a story like this, I think.
Most definitely does. Um, I just think you did a good job. I was wondering if I tried to imagine myself in your position, and I know you covered the story in extensive detail, but I still was thinking about the children in the situations. Was there any kind of feeling afterwards that you were like, man, I hope this was enough to put some attention on them to hopefully correct some things?
Yeah. I think that thought came up for sure, and trying to figure out what does a follow-up look like. That's on my to-do list for this year, is to write a follow-up. It's been a couple of years since all this happened. How are things shaking out now? Are there still problems? Yeah, so I definitely think, once you write the story, that can't be the end. And the challenge is for you to figure out, how do I continue to put pressure on this? How do I continue to inform people? How do I continue to talk to people who've been impacted? And that can be difficult. You have to get creative sometimes. But yeah, it definitely on my mind of, I don't want it to be a like parachute journalism where you fly in and you write one story and then you never come back. I wanted it to be something that was more ongoing. And so I've got some plans in the works to continue following up on this too.
I'm happy to hear that. Yeah, well, at least this time, hopefully, you'll have someone to assist you with some of the heavy lifting.
Maybe it'll probably just be me, but that's okay. We've got a good team.
Right on. Well, I'm sure it'll be great. Um, I just really appreciate you doing this for me.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I'm happy to help.
I love being able to pull somebody from Chickasha that actually ended up successful, and that's pretty much my goal always.
Yeah, I say whenever I have a chance to do something from somebody from Chickasha, we'll do it.
Right on, Kayla. Well, you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Good luck with everything this week. I hope it goes smoothly.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Me too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. See you later.